We're honored today to welcome Ellen Souls. Ellen received a master's degree in rural geography with an emphasis on hydrology of semi-arid river systems from Northern Arizona University in 2003. She taught in the departments of geography and environmental engineering at NAU till 2007. Afterwards, she worked with the National Park Service Inventory and Monitoring Program to establish and implement monitoring strategies for assessing long-term ecological trends in parks across the southern Colorado Plateau. Her work since 2000 has focused on interactions between alluvial groundwater and surface flows, including the assessments of dam removal projects in the White Mountains of Arizona, and collecting long-term alluvial water levels and topographic data sets to analyze the effects of flow regime on vegetation communities in the Gila River. And monitoring recovery of hydrologic function following various stream restoration projects. She maintains a monitoring program established in 2007 at the Pitchfork Ranch to document the effects of restoration work on recovery of a historical ciénaga in the Burro Ciénega watershed. This is just south of Silver City, for those of you who know southwestern New Mexico. So Ellen will be telling us about the monitoring on the Pitchfork Ranch with a presentation entitled Recovery of Hydrologic Connectivity Following Low-Tech Restoration Work in a Degraded Ciénaga, Southwest New Mexico. Take it away, Lucinda.
Whoops. It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Can you try one more time because I clicked the right button?
Oh, okay.
Does it still say it?
No, I'm checking. Let's see, share screen. Okay, are you seeing that?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So that was a bunch of syllables. I wish I hadn't said quite so much about myself and what I sent to Jeff. Yeah, it's a little embarrassing. Anyway, today I do want to talk about the results of our hydrologic monitoring to date, following a bunch of restoration work that's occurred in Burro Ciénega on the Pitchfork Ranch in southwest New Mexico. I want to be sure to mention our poster children here. Can you see my cursor as well? Good. So these are a couple of Chiricahua leopard frogs, which are part of a population, I think, that was most recently surveyed as about 40 individuals. They were introduced to the Pitchfork in 2006 and have happily resided there ever since. We're very, very happy with our Chiricahua leopard frogs. Okay. So to orient you, as Jeff said, we are on the Pitchfork. We are a little south of Silver City. The Burro Ciénega is actually a water course about 45 miles long, which originates at the Continental Divide at about 6,000 foot elevation. It terminates way down here in a dry playa system south of I-10. And this area here, this area here is reproduced in this map here. So here is the upper Burro Ciénega watershed, and the Pitchfork Ranch is outlined in brown here. It occupies the lower part of the upper watershed. The Pitchfork occupies high elevation Chihuahuan desert grasslands. This is an overview, a beauty shot of part of the Pitchfork Ranch. I'm sure that kind of landscape will look familiar to most or all of you. This is an overview of the Pitchfork. Unfortunately, as I feared, we're not going to be able to see much at this scale, but I'm going to zero in on this area here in a moment. This is what we call the Ciénaga Reach at the upstream end of Burro Ciénega on the Pitchfork. But hopefully you can see at least some symbols here, which are indicating repeat photo points. Whoops. back for a second. Repeat photo points in these orange areas. A ton of restoration structures, which are indicated by these red and other colored symbols, both in tributary drainages and throughout the Pitchfork, throughout Burro Ciénega itself. And also some hydrologic monitoring sites in the Ciénaga Reach. We have a well transect at the upstream end. We have a well transect near the downstream end. And we have a couple of recording stage gauges in between. Historical impacts to the Burro Ciénega channel, of course, include, you know, all the usual suspects: channelization, road work, poorly managed grazing, all that sort of thing. Okay, so focusing in on the Ciénaga Reach, here you can see more clearly the number of structures that have been built throughout this reach. So this has been quite a labor of love for the Coles for many years, not to overstress the point. These are, this is our upstream well transect, this is our downstream well transect, and we actually have recording stage gauge here, and then one down here. These are in a couple of pool areas. Let's see, the historical wetland or ciénaga occupied this area in here. It's about 30 to 50 acres. And of course, you know, the channelization of the Burro Ciénega channel itself drained all of the water that once used to be in that wetland supporting this kind of marsh area. I would guess that all of you know what a ciénaga is. It's a marsh which is specific to the southwestern US, and it's often associated with a perennial source of water. In this case, very near the P1 transect line, there was a historic spring, which we believe is still, contributing at least a little bit of seepage to the Ciénaga channel. These ecosystems are extremely rare. I think it's estimated that 95% of them throughout the Southwest have disappeared or been degraded since the early 1800s. Because they are capable of sequestering such enormous amounts of carbon when they are fully functioning, they're considered a primary tool for climate restoration strategies. And I just wanted to point out that this channel is now stuffed with, boy, I sure wish I could keep track of my cursor. The Burro Ciénega channel is now stuffed with trees that mostly have recolonized the channel since about 2007. But our hope over time actually is that these trees are going to drown as the channel degrades and we restore wetland conditions to the Ciénaga. Okay, I want to take a second to talk about this restoration work at the Pitchfork, and to point out that we are not after any kind of channel stabilization in this work. Rather, we're after recovering, you know, those fabled words, ecosystem resilience, by recovering some of the natural processes that, of course, have been severely impacted over the past 200 years. So I'm going to start out talking about restoration tiers. And to explain what I mean is, by a tier, we're talking about any restoration structure: a woven weir, a one rock dam, some kind of baffle or vein, which is deliberately constructed to capture 6 inches to maybe 18 inches of sediment. We do not get greedy with our restoration work at the Pitchfork. And so, of course, as that tier goes into practice and we have a runoff event, it slows down the runoff, which then, of course, captures sediment. That sediment degrades the channel, which also helps to retain groundwater and move surface water into the groundwater system, which then, of course, aids in vegetation recovery, which again jumpstarts sediment aggradation and so forth. So that's why I've shown this as a cycle, not surprisingly. And then as that occurs and that first tier becomes filled up with sediment, and we hope with some vegetation, we build a second tier on top of the first to capture more sediment. So here are some examples of the restoration strategies at the Pitchfork, which are mostly low tech, often manual. There is some machine work involved because we are talking about moving some very large rocks in some cases. The strategies include all of these things that I'm sure you've heard of: post vanes and baffles, one rock dams, Zuni bowls, a road closure. There used to be a road that ran directly up the Burro Ciénega channel, and that road has been closed and moved to upland areas. Cattle, of course, have been exclosed from the Ciénega area. There have been a limited number of plantings. Most of the vegetation that has now colonized this reach has just kind of come in naturally. And there is a technique which I very much hope that AT will be able to tell you about, called hinge felling. That's why I mark it with an exclamation point, because it's a very low cost and very effective method of aggrading the channel bottom. So this is what we call a crisscross perpendicular vein before and after backfilling up here at the top left and top, top center, I guess I would say. And then at the bottom right is one of my favorite photos. That's AT standing in front of 3 tiers of one rock dam work, which have aggraded the amount of sediment that you can see upstream of those one rock dams. I find that quite impressive. So one of our monitoring strategies, of course, is repeat photos, which AT and Cinda have taken faithfully since 2005, I think, in October of every year. So photo point 1 is at the very upstream end of the Ciénega Reach. This is looking downstream in 2005. It doesn't look too bad, but it doesn't look too great either. And this is that same location 18 years later. You can see the amount of vegetation that has colonized the region. And although you can't really tell it, more than 1 meter of sediment has been captured in that very upstream reach by 3 tiers of woven weirs and perhaps some other restoration work. And I believe that they have since done some hinge felling in that reach. I'm just going to kind of blaze through this and assume that people will either stop me and ask questions or ask questions at the end, because I obviously have a lot of stuff to cover in a very short period of time. So this is photo point 2 at one of our favorite spots, which is called the Willow Pond. It's a very long pond in about the center of the Ciénega Reach. In 2005, the Willow Pond was severely incised. There was a head cut that was migrating upstream at the upstream end of the pool. And a bunch of work occurred, including some rock work at the upstream end of that pool to arrest the head cut. And so within this first 4-year period, quite a large amount of herbaceous vegetation and young willows had accumulated at this site. And then last year, although you can't even see the water because of the cattails and the fallen leaves and so forth, the perennial water at this site is now about 1 meter deep, at least 1 meter deep, about year round. And the pond is more than 100 meters long, and it is stuffed with cattails and all kinds of stuff that the Chiricahua leopard frogs really depend upon for refugia and so forth. So this is the last of the photo points that I'll show. This is at the downstream end where the Burro Ciénega channel kind of transitions from that ciénaga and nearly perennial reach to the intermittent reach, and then eventually the ephemeral reach farther downstream. So at this site in 2009, the channel was deeply incised and it was pretty dry looking. In 2012, 3 years later, after a lot of one rock dam and other work in this area, the channel had aggraded. We do not do geomorphic surveys in this reach, so I can't tell you by how much, but clearly it was quite a lot. And then in 2022, we had some huge floods here on the Gila, which is about 90 miles from the Pitchfork. we had one of our floods of, actually two of our floods of record in quick succession in 2022. And I included this photo to show that the herbaceous vegetation, although it's been flattened, is still intact, and there has been no major incision and perhaps even some deposition at this site. So vegetation is great stuff. Monitoring work. So I just wanted to give an overview with some photos to keep this interesting, because we're going to get into the drier stuff here in a minute. So originally in 2007, we were monitoring groundwater levels at those 2 well transects in the Ciénega Reach using 1 1/4 inch galvanized drive point wells. And this is AT sitting there finalizing work on one of the wells. These wells are extremely sturdy. My wells on the Gila, I have about 20 wells on the Gila. And during those 2022 floods, I lost the first of those wells to floods in, well, it's been close to 20 years. So they are amazingly resilient. I also wanted to point out that next to AT on the ground here is our post pounder, which is a custom built, very heavy, very effective post pounder for driving sandpoint wells. And we've named it Ned because it rhymes with lead. I always have to say that. So here's one of our workers, Curtis Staley and AT, working on the 1 1/2 inch augered wells that we replaced or placed next to our original wells in 2020. And the reason for that was that I wanted to increase the length of screen that was extending into the water table in order to reduce the need for frequent purging of the wells. I had to purge those galvanized wells about once every 3 to 4 months just to keep them from clogging up with sediment, because of course the Ciénaga soils are very, very fine, and there is even a clay layer. So it tended to clog up those well screens, which then of course messed up our data. So we replaced them with 1 1/2 inch PVC with about 5-foot screen lengths. Here's one of our PVC wells. I'm collecting measurements at this well. This is at the upstream P1 transect with what we call an E-tape. Whoops. Sorry. And we also in 2020 began monitoring surface water levels by installing a couple of recording stage gauges. One of them is below the arrow here. This is at the Willow Pond. And these are extremely simple and have turned out to be, knock on wood, quite durable. We built them of heavy duty 1 1/2 inch angle iron with the angle of the angle iron pointing upstream. And then we bolted a piece of heavy duty PVC pipe to the inside of the angle on the downstream exposure of the angle iron. It's about 1 1/2 or 2 feet long and extends down below the water surface about 1 1/2 feet. And then there's a recording pressure transducer suspended inside that PVC, which then acts as kind of a stilling well. They are pounded into the channel bottom quite far. I think this one is actually more than 6 feet deep into the channel bottom. It was about a 10-foot piece of angle iron to start with. And then finally, we survey all of our monitoring installations by total station to a common datum so that we can keep track of how what the relationships are among our service. I told my dog Edgar that I would give him a mention in this presentation, so here he is supervising our surveying efforts in 2020. So speaking of dry, this is a Palmer Drought Severity Index chart for the period from 1950 to 2024. The yellow below the 0 line, of course, is bad. The black line here is a running average of 2-year running average. And you can see that since 2021, things have gotten pretty wicked in the, what do they call it? The Southwest Desert Climate Division. That's what NOAA calls this area that the Pitchfork is located in. So clearly, as we all know, things are getting hotter and drier. which is one reason that I'm very glad that we started monitoring at the Pitchfork a long time ago. So I wanted to quickly talk about our geomorphic survey. So this is a comparison of the channel profile from the upstream end of the Pitchfork through the Ciénaga Reach all the way downstream for about 1,400 meters. The black line is the 2020 survey. The blue line was the water surface that we surveyed in 2020. And this gray dotted line is the 2007 survey. And again, it's unfortunate that you can't see it very well, but one of the things that I wanted to point out was how much more complex longitudinally the channel bottom has become since 2007 as a consequence of all of these restoration structures that have been built. There are a great many more pool features, which of course capture water and change the water slope at those points. Water that's captured in those pools then is able, especially at low flows, to kind of move downstream as hyporheic flow, which I think has a great influence on water levels as you move from upstream to downstream through the reach. These are our hydrologic monitoring installations. This is our P1 well transect at the upstream end, our recording stage gauge at the Willow Pond, our P2 well transect, and then our recording stage gauge a little downstream of that. So one of the things that we've monitored are water temperatures in order to try to track what the effect of some of this work has been. Unfortunately, we've really only been monitoring water temperatures because we needed surface water temperatures to really track effects since 2020, which is when we installed the stage gauges. So my hypothesis, I suppose I would say, is that hyporheic flow is reflected in upstream to downstream water temperatures. So these are water temperatures moving from the upstream well transect to the downstream recording stage gauges during the months of April through June, which I consider to be the spring months. Clearly in this region, our hottest, driest temperatures are in the spring and summer. And increasingly, we used to be able to count on a fairly good monsoon beginning in July in most years, but increasingly, hot and dry is extending into August and even into September some years, just as predicted. So kind of taking a look at these water temperatures. Gosh, sorry, I can't function without my cursor. So this is 2021 water temperatures, 2022, and so forth. From the first bar in each series is the upstream groundwater well. The second bar is the upstream stage gauge. So those are surface water temperatures, then groundwater, then surface water. And so you can see in the springtime that there's not much difference between surface and groundwater temperatures. There's a maximum of about 3 degrees variance between those two. But interestingly to me, the same thing is true even during the very hot summer months when our air temperatures may be above 95 degrees, or often not above 95 degrees during the day. This variance from groundwater to surface water in 2022 is a consequence of those large floods. So interestingly, it's not during low flows that things heat up. It's during big floods that things tend to heat up the most. Oops, I think I've done it again. These are box plots of water levels. So the upper panel are springtime water levels, again, April through June for each of the years indicated. To keep this simple, I decided to give a sample of 4 years from our earliest data collection period. And then the most recent 4 years of 2020 through 2023, again, for the periods of April through June every year. One of the things I wanted to point out in this graph is the thalweg elevation. This is the channel thalweg in 2020 at the upstream well transect. And this was the thalweg elevation in 2014. So more than a meter has collected at that upstream well transect site. You can see that water temperatures varied much less in the earlier period than in this later period. I'm sorry, water levels, not temperatures. And that we have seen some pretty significant drops in water elevations, groundwater elevations in 2021 and 2022 at that upstream site. The same thing is true for the summer months of July through September. They tended to be more stable way back when in the good old days, and have dropped somewhat since then. And this again is a consequence, this 2022 very wide bar is a consequence of those big floods. And then in 2023, it drops back down again. So this again is from the upstream well. At the downstream well, however, things look a little bit better. For the spring months, the earlier months, again, the water levels were very tight. I'll point out that in 2012, sometime during the spring, I must have purged this well because you can see the very slow recharge rate of the well, which is reflected in this long outlier bar. And then in 2020 through 2023, actually, there's been improvement at the downstream well. The water levels are slightly higher from April to June than they were in the earlier period. At this transect, the thalweg has graded about half a meter. But I will also point out that between 2007 and 2014, we surveyed nearly a half meter of aggradation. So between the two of them, again, there's been about a meter of aggradation at this site as well. For the summer months, same kind of pattern, things are generally better. In 2023, I'm not sure what happened at this well. There's been a decline in groundwater levels, although I don't think there really was much of one at the upstream well. Let me take a look back at that. Oh, there was. Never mind. Oh, I guess the thing I didn't point out about any of these graphs is this vertical scale, which is 4 meters on all of the graphs. And that's going to become important at the next slide because here, what I decided to do was to compare what was happening at the upstream well in these most recent 4 years with what was happening in the downstream well during these most recent 4 years. And so what's interesting to me is that clearly restoration is working. The upstream well is, because it's at the upstream end of the ranch, it's basically above all of the restoration work that has occurred. And so we saw in the earlier slide how much lower water levels were dropping in the spring and in the summer months down here in the bottom panel. But at the downstream well, that hasn't been the case. In fact, water levels have basically increased almost every year relative to the 2009 to 2012 period, which suggests to me that the restoration work is in fact capturing a lot of runoff and a lot of groundwater, which is then sustaining our water levels at the downstream end of this reach. I think that's about all I felt that I could stuff into this presentation, aside from a pitch for A.T. and Cinda's book, Restoring the Pitchfork Ranch, which was published by University of Arizona Press. And a big thank you, and I think that's it.
Thank you, Ellen. When you mentioned that picture with A.T. standing in front of the several generations of One Rock dams, I'd already typed into the chat that that lower right picture is crazy. So obviously that was, you know, some great success there.
Yes.
Are there any questions from anybody?
Please.
I wonder, while people are chewing on all that, I wonder if you could go back to a little bit of box and whisker data. Actually, if you would, could you go back to the picture of installing those wells? Or your monitoring wells?
Yes, I think it's here. Whoops.
So we've had some luck putting in wells with an auger,
Mm-hmm.
not so much with the post pounder. We also have our own custom post pounder.
Ah,
That weighs about 32 pounds, I think. It's pretty heavy.
uh-huh.
So if you could share your screen again.
Let me see if I can do that. Okay.
And if anybody has a question, just go ahead and butt in. Because I'm just gonna go, I have a couple of things, thought maybe we go over again. So y'all originally put in iron pipes? AT put
Yes, those
in,
are 1¼ inch galvanized wells. Yeah, with 3-foot screens on them.
and were those just from Granger or something, do you know? Were those sand
Exactly.
pits or are they uh I'm guessing those are sand points. It was all
Yes, they are.
yeah.
Yes, they are from Granger. And of course, we build them with the pipe and drive couplings, those heavy duty drive couplings, and then we just beat them in as I'm sure you're familiar with, sounds like.
Did you beat up, did you buy heavy duty pipe pieces or did you just buy pipe from the hardware store?
No, we bought everything from Granger. So I don't know how heavy duty it is, but it holds up well. So it must be fairly heavy duty.
And then you went to PVC so you could get a longer screen.
Right.
And those again were put in with an auger.
Yes. With the ratcheting auger. In
Uh,
fact, that's what Curtis is using in that right-hand photo.
We've had some luck getting them into fine grains, but not into our gravels.
Yeah, it's very difficult to use an auger in gravel.
Well, we were pounding them in.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, we dug a
So
hole.
do you run into cobble? Is that what happens?
Yeah, well, something, you get refusal at, a meter and a half, you just,
Oh, no.
yeah.
Ow.
I don't think it's bedrock, I think it's just a big rock in the way.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, would you mind moving on to back to your, that first water surface elevation graph?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, it often takes me a little bit, you just passed it. That longitudinal profile up,
Oh, the longitudinal profile.
it takes me a little longer to understand graphs than we had there. So could you
Oh, I know. I hate racing through them. Yeah,
could you go over this one more time, please?
sure. So these are this is the thalweg of the Burro Ciénega channel through what we call this was a study of the Chiricahua Leopard Frog that we conducted the 2020 work for. So there's a gray dotted line for the first 600 meters, which was the channel profile, the thalweg in 2007. And if we could zoom in on it, you would see that it's a much simpler line than the later line is, as this channel, what I call longitudinal complexity, has increased with these pools and so forth. The black dashed line, it was the survey in 2020, and the blue line was the water surface in 2020.
That's awesome. So when did this scouring event happen?
Well, there have been a number of scouring events, but this scour is kind of by design, downstream of woven weirs and so forth. You get that drop off that tends then to scour out a new small pool. And these have been relatively stable over time. I did not put the 2014 survey on here because it was just too complicated, but many of the pools on here have been present since 2014. Let's see, what else can I tell you about this? Oh, I don't know. Feel free to ask questions.
No, I think it makes sense, and then the, your later box and arrow, box and whisker, plots that were showing groundwater temperatures, that were less than the surface water. Go on down.
Yeah, they're not box and whisker. Actually, these are just columns.
Oh, yeah, you're right, the other one was elevations,
Yeah. And so these are temperatures in degrees C here. And this is moving from upstream to downstream. So upstream well, upstream surface water, downstream well, downstream surface water. I wanted to just kind of look at them in a row like that to see, it just seemed like a more obvious way to compare things. So this first graph is during the spring, April through June, and then this is, and I should point out, these are maximum water temperatures. These are not any percentile. These are the absolute maximum water temperatures during spring and summer months.
are your well transects? You said transects, are those longitudinal, or are you actually putting 2 or 3?
No, we had originally installed 3 wells on transects across the channel, and those are surveyed, but I don't find those cross-section surveys to be very useful for what we're doing here. And we are currently, and we had 2 of those 3 wells on each transect instrumented with a recording pressure transducer. But we are currently recording only data from 1 PVC well on each of those transects, because I feel like we know what happens across the transect.
So if you were redesigning, if you were redoing the network like this, you would probably just put one well and move downstream, stick another, and just sort of think about it longitudinally rather than across the.
For this work, I would, yeah. On the Gila, my work's very different, so I am quite interested in what's happening across, the valley bottom, but here not so much.
Anyone else have questions? I know at least one person needs to get to class at 2 o'clock, so I think we can.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, I had some quick questions for you. There was I'll just say at the beginning, I think you answered this already, but it's pretty awesome to think that your data there is suggesting that with less water coming into the system, you're actually holding more water in the system than was there before y'all did y'all's work, right? So that's awesome. And then to kind of get into the weeds a little bit on how y'all were going about, like with the structures, the in-stream structures, you had woven weirs and rock weirs, and you had the picture up at the beginning of your slideshow that was a trench dug with kind of the alternating posts coming out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we were just discussing something like this. And so I'm curious, when y'all finished that, well, for one, it seems to be that maybe those are about 5 feet deep with only about 18 inches sticking up. Did y'all find that height above ground to what was in ground was important to kind of prevent them from getting pushed over? And then also, did y'all come back and weave between these posts on this one, or was this just left to catch debris in the stream?
Wow, what great questions. Yeah, so your measurements are about right. And as I said, we don't try to capture too much at any given time, because we have found that leaving the tops of those exposed more than 18 inches or 2 feet above the channel bottom simply means that they break, because these in particular are far downstream where the channel is much wider, and you can have some really major floods moving some really big stuff. So we just found that they got destroyed, or a piece of them got destroyed, which then funneled the water, which then of course, kind of negated the whole object of the work. These were not woven afterwards. The channel farther downstream is very, very sandy as opposed to to the substrate that you find upstream in the Ciénaga. So things tend to move a lot. You know, I think the whole bed becomes mobile during some of these floods. And so that's why we put them so deep.
And is that what you're calling a post vein?
Yeah.
Okay.
We call these a perpendicular post vein, a crisscross perpendicular post vein.
Crisscross because you have one kind of alternating, or
Yeah, because they're kind of going down into the channel this way. Yeah.
yeah, okay. Well, thank you. Really, really great presentation. I really
Thank you.
There was some really good information in here. We just had a meeting this morning discussing how hard it is for us to get brush to some of our sites. And often the rock is too far away too. So we were wondering what the heck we were gonna do. So there's definitely some ideas in here that we're gonna utilize.
Yeah, and I guess AT's not here yet. Is that right?
I don't see them, but we've
That's
recorded it and we'll send it to them. So
okay. One of the things that I know that he's discovered about anything built of wood in this channel is that it needs to be juniper or some kind of, you know, some kind of hardwood. He used pine during some stage of restoration, and he was really sorry that he did, you know. So for whatever it's worth, don't use pine.
well, we're gonna use some pine. 2 years ago, when I was trying to get materials, I bought a truckload of pine because I couldn't get juniper. So, anyway.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay.
We'll just use more of it.
So, you know, as long as we're on this slide, I will talk about hinge felling. Are you working anywhere where you have trees growing?
To some extent.
Yeah.
One location,
Are you familiar with hinge felling?
I know.
You are. Okay, well, never mind then. I don't need to tell you about it. Good, word's getting out.
Yeah, well, all you gotta do is spend time in the creek and you can see where trees have fallen over and continue to grow.
Right.
That's really what hinge felling is, y'all, is you lay a cottonwood or a willow over and it continues to grow.
Mhm.
And it just basically adds a lot more woody debris really quick.
Mhm.
Do you have any anything that you've seen that you really, I mean, did you really like hinge felling? Did you notes from the field on hinge felling for us?
Oh, I really do like hinge felling. Mostly because it's cheap and effective. You know, one of the big problems with this stuff, of course, you all know better than anyone, is the cost. And so trying to come up with low cost methods that will encourage private landowners, because so many of these areas are on private lands. I mean, you know, people who occupied these places weren't stupid. They took the water sites. So, you know, trying to encourage private landowners to do this work, there has to be some kind of economic, not justification, but some kind of economics that come into play. And hinge felling is obviously remarkably cheap. And I know that in the Ciénaga Reach, a lot of that aggradation has come about as a consequence of perhaps 2 days spent hinge felling mostly willows into the channel. And we also do it onto the floodplains, you know, because we're trying to build up that entire channel bottom. So yeah, I was surprised that I didn't have any photos, but I couldn't find any in the time that I had.
I have one more question about that hinge felling. Did y'all find that y'all increased the success by cutting a notch and letting it fall towards the notch? If you could imagine the mouth kind of closing, versus cutting the backside and then letting that fall over, which would kind of, in my analogy, open the mouth all the way up. So
Yeah,
I kind of have a theory that it might pitch closed and then heal over better if you close the mouth, but
yeah, no, we because we have, you know, this near constant water source, at least groundwater source, we weren't concerned about them healing because they just take off like rockets. You know, I mean, hinge felling that occurred 2 years ago, the sprouts coming up now are 20 feet tall. So,
Oh,
no, we cut them from the backside and leave a good amount attached at the channel facing side and fell it that way.
okay.
Are y'all doing veg monitoring?
I'm sorry?
Are y'all doing vegetation monitoring?
No, I'm afraid we're not. No.
Are y'all following
We
any
were-
standard, like the aquatic aim protocol? The assessment inventory monitoring from BLM or anything? Any of those protocols? Okay.
It's just me.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I get it. I get it. All right, well, we better go. Appreciate your time, Ellen, very much. And
Okay, thank you guys. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm sorry I was late.
no worries.
Thank you so much.